This is reading number 3, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. So if you ask me, education can play a crucial role in the climate crisis. Coming from an educator, it's probably not too surprising that I believe this. What you may find surprising is that climate change deniers also find educators and education of central importance. And they're doing something about it in a big way. 2016 report from the National Center for Science Education, that's the NCSE, revealed that as many as 30% of K through 12 teachers are teaching that climate change is a two-sided argument and that many scientists see natural causes behind recent global warming. Conversely, more than half of K through 12 teachers do not teach climate change at all, and those who do teach it only devote an hour or two to the issue. Part of the problem is that many of these teachers are themselves unclear on the facts. The most referenced of all papers on climate change notes that 97% of scientists are in agreement that anthropogenic climate change is real and happening. However, when questioned about this scientific consensus by the NCSE, only 30% of middle school and 45% of high school students selected the correct answer from a broad range, and the correct answer is between 81 and 100% in this range. In other words, even if they thought just 80% or 90% of scientists were in consensus, they would have still selected the right answer, but they didn't. So why are so many teachers confused about the climate crisis? This confusion is not too surprising, as teachers have been targeted by fossil fuel affiliates like the Heartland Institute. I'll talk more about this particular organization in a minute or two. And the Heartland Institute mailed 300,000 unsolicited and free copies of the book, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, a portion of which we are reading, to K through 12 teachers across the U.S. in 2017. As the Heartland Institute notes, this book purports to explain, quote, why the claim of consensus, in other words, that 97% figure, on the causes and consequences of climate change is without merit. The authors, according to them, comprehensively and specifically rebuke the surveys and studies used to support the claims of a consensus. They then provide a detailed survey of the physical science of global warming, close quote. Although sent to K through 12 teachers, the real targets are, of course, children, as the goal is to teach them climate change skepticism by way of the people that they trust the most in this regard, their school teachers. Assuming that each of the teachers that received this book teaches around 30 children, this approach could potentially teach climate change skepticism to 10 million American children. And this, of course, is just in 1 year. Hence, we are really talking about tens of millions of children. As you will see when reading Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, this does not read like the rants of a fringe group, but rather is built upon carefully constructed arguments. Don't be at all surprised if it causes you to become a little skeptical yourself. That's why it was written, and written very carefully. Incidentally, even if K through 12 teachers are correctly informed and desire to teach the climate crisis, in a number of states, Maine, South Dakota, and Virginia, for example, bills have recently been introduced that would hamper their efforts. The Virginia bill argues that this is necessary because, quote, many teachers in public elementary and secondary school classrooms are abusing taxpayer resources and abusing their ability to speak to captive audience of students in an attempt to indoctrinate or influence students under the guise of, quote, teaching for social justice or other sectarian doctrines, close quote. If this sounds familiar, it may well be because dozens of states are similarly attempting to ban the teaching of critical race theory, which draws attention to another truth, the fact that racism is systematic in the United States and has been ever since our country was founded. In many ways, these efforts to ban the teaching of critical race theory were led by former President Donald Trump, who said that it is, quote, propaganda and, quote, left-wing indoctrination, close quote, and that, quote, this horrible doctrine, teaching this to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of the words, close quote. In any event, some states are attempting to go even further in mandating that children be taught that the scientific consensus on climate change is simply wrong. A bill introduced in Montana in 2019 states that, quote, when providing education and informational materials on climate change, the following findings should be observed. I'm quoting here. Reasonable amounts of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere have no verifiable impact on the environment. Science shows human emissions do not change atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions enough to cause climate change. Claims that carbon associated with human activity causes climate change are invalid, and nature, not human activity, causes climate change. Close quote. As the book Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming makes clear, Americans are clearly being influenced by a massive campaign of disinformation that has been ongoing for decades now, supported by a range of groups that include a number of conservative think tanks, generally referred to as CTTs, such as the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and these are all funded by fossil fuel companies or their affiliates like the Koch brothers. Dating from the Reagan administration and earlier, these groups have long seen themselves, I'm quoting the Cato Institute here, as the defenders of, quote, America's heritage of individual liberty, free markets, and constitutionally limited government, close quote. In practice, the Heartland Institute, which publishes the book that we are reading, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, has, for example, fought bitterly against issues like tobacco legislation, which was one of the earliest initiatives that it had in the 1980s. At that time, it received funding from, not surprisingly, the tobacco industry. With respect to climate change, a 2013 study by two scholars, and that's Riley Dunlap and Peter Jacques, which looked at over 100 English-language books denying anthropogenic climate change dating from the 1980s to 2010, found verifiable links to CTT groups for 87% of those emerging from publishing houses, and links with self-publishing denial books now proliferating are even more difficult to trace. That number was once even higher. 100% of all books from the 1980s and 95% from the 1990s. So what does all that mean? Simply put, if you pick up a book denying that anthropogenic climate change is real, it is exceptionally likely that it was published or financed by a conservative think tanks funded by the fossil fuel industry. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. CTT support a range of other websites, blogs, other online activities, YouTube channels, in addition to more traditional advertising. A billboard campaign by the Heartland Institute featured a photograph of convicted Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who thinks of himself as an environmentalist, beside the words, I still believe in global warming. Do you? A television commercial by the Competitive Enterprise Institute argued that greenhouse gas CO2 is not, in fact, a contributing factor to climate change. To the contrary, it is represented as, quote, essential to life. We breathe it in, plants breathe it out. They call it pollution. We call it life. Close quote. These conservative think tanks also directly attack science and scientists in response to the definitive reports on climate change produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's the IPCC. The Heartland Institute commissioned its own group, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the NIPCC, which has produced over a dozen reports comprising thousands of pages. This book from which we are reading, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, is in some sense similar to the IPCC summary for policymakers, as it is produced by the NIPCC in order to deliver its finding to policymakers and others. With this goal in mind, more than 50,000 copies of the first edition were sold or given away in 5 months to elected officials, civil and business leaders, scientists, and other opinion leaders. That's close quote. With the second edition, from which we are reading, the Heartland Institute widened their free distribution of the book as they posted the entire book online as a PDF, which is how we're getting it, what we're reading. In addition, as noted above, the Heartland Institute mailed 300,000 copies of the second edition of this book to teachers across the U.S. In short, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming is designed to make a range of individuals question whether anthropogenic climate change is in fact real. Policymakers, and by that I mean politicians and business leaders, educators, and by extension, tens of millions of children and others, by making this book available to everyone as a free PDF. So I'm curious to hear what you think about the portion of Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming that you read, and the larger issue of this campaign of disinformation in general, as well as how it is specifically being aimed at children by way of educators. So what's going to follow now, of course, is our normal format, and this will be a discussion of why scientists disagree about global warming. And as usual, note that the following observations, which are in italics in the actual text, have not been paraphrased or altered, though I do correct the occasional typo, and because of space concerns, often just part of the comment is reproduced here, along with my reply. In working through these, I will first quote an observation by a student, followed by my thoughts. There were literally hundreds of comments that expressed a sentiment similar to this first one. The first quote: "I've never been more angry reading a document. The authors of Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming are lying through their teeth for money." And here's another example. This reading, as well as the attached Amazon reviews, really pissed me off. To be honest, it really pisses me off, too. As we have seen, the direct consequences of the rise of greenhouse gases, GHG emissions, are more than a little frightening. Even if every person in every country on the planet agreed to quickly and decisively mitigate the climate crisis, this would still be a formidable challenge, likely the greatest challenge that humanity has ever collectively faced. However, as Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming makes clear, we face another challenge, which is in some sense even more, or at least every bit as formidable, as the fossil fuel industry is working in a whole host of ways to attempt to keep us from acting quickly and decisively to mitigate the climate crisis. And make no mistake, they're doing a pretty good job of it. If you're unfamiliar with their methods, you might easily dismiss their efforts, right? Before I started studying climate change denial literature a few years ago, I have to really confess to not taking it very seriously. That was a mistake. I quickly realized that an enormous amount of work was being put into this literature, and perhaps not surprisingly, as a consequence, it can be very effective at causing people to doubt the validity and or the severity of the climate crisis. How effective is this particular book? I just checked the Amazon reviews of it, which gave it a rating of a 4.2. This is all the more astonishing as a number of people gave it scathing reviews, such as the most popular one, which begins, and I quote, "This is one of the most egregious attempts to diffuse any supportive fact on the existence of global warming and climate change that I have ever read," close quote. In contrast, there were many reviews with labels which had labels like, quote, "well documented and provides much needed balance to the climate crisis debate," close quote, and another, quote, "should be a mandatory read for media and politicians," close quote. There are clearly far more positive reviews, which accounts for that 4.2 rating. In any event, hundreds of people in Climate Change 101 had the same reaction when they read our selection from Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. Their gut response was to get angry, which, as far as I am concerned, given the circumstances, is entirely appropriate. I don't quite understand what an individual will gain by publishing more and clean and green, for pushing for a more clean and green environment. If you just happen upon the book Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming or any similar climate change denial literature, you may well have this same question. After all, what is to be gained by pushing for a greener and cleaner environment other than, well, a greener and cleaner environment and future? In other words, what could possibly be the secret agenda here? After all, we hardly need one, as this is obviously a worthy goal in itself. Nonetheless, climate change deniers have come up with a variety of conspiracy theories, questioning the motives of climate change scientists and activists. One is that climate change scientists are corrupt and are receiving money to sell the American public on the idea of climate change. On the cover of the book, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Scientists by Tim Ball, a wad of cash is being exchanged between two hands. So, who's providing the payoff money here? According to this theory, it is coming from a range of institutions, including the federal government, as they are purportedly pursuing a goal that has nothing to do with the environment and climate, which brings us to the big conspiracy theory here. So, when communism collapsed, in the early 1990s around the world, the United States was presented with something of an epistemological dilemma. In other words, a challenge to the way that the U.S. understood itself. In order to develop and maintain a sense of self, all sorts of entities are locked in a binary structure with another. For example, the idea of men as strong, capable, and emotionally stable is consolidated by imagining an opposite of men, an other, as weak, incapable, and as emotionally unstable, and that's women. Such binary structures in opposition, which obviously do a profound violence to the imagined other, in this case women, are unfortunately sadly common. Racism has long been functioning by postulating inferior others to the normative white self. But during the Cold War, the United States postulated communist countries as the other. Hence, the most conspicuous feature of Americans was that we were free and happy because people in communist countries were imagined as neither free nor happy. Hence, communism was perceived as a profound threat to our way of life. However, when the Cold War and the so-called Red Scare ended, the United States suddenly found itself without an other. But not to worry, as very quickly a new entity replaced communism as the threat to America and our way of life. So what replaced the Red Scare of communism? Environmentalism, as the phrase, quote, green is the new red, close quote, came on the scene. In this case, this doesn't make intuitive sense, so allow me to explain the logic. The particular aspect of communism at issue here is that it's a form of big government. Imagine two very different ways of government. On the one hand, a system where government is small and plays a relatively small role in our lives. In such an approach, the economy and corporations are allowed to largely function freely without unnecessary government intervention. In the other extreme, of which the large communist experiments of the 20th century, and by that I mean, the Soviet Union and Mao's China, they're prime examples, large government is in direct control of the economy and corporations. This is government at its biggest. So what does this all have to do with environmentalism and being green? The theory here, the conspiracy theory here, is that all sorts of restrictive government regulations will be introduced under the guise of being environmental. Because these restrictions are being cast as benign and good, we will allow them to be adopted without realizing the hidden agenda here, and that's to create a large and stronger government like communism or socialism. In terms of the climate crisis, many of the nations of the world need to act together on this particular issue. The fear is that this project will go even further, linking up individual countries to act essentially as a world government, which is also, allegedly the goal of communism. In other words, in this view, environmentalism is a particularly insidious way of bringing big government and communism back. Of course, this does raise the question of who stands to gain here. Well, it's not going to be people or the planet, as reduced environmental restrictions puts us at greater risk. In contrast, corporations that would act as freely as possible without government intervention stand to gain a lot here. In particular, the fossil fuel industry has an enormous amount at risk. If you measure the wealth of companies by their revenues, Apple ranks number 10 in the world, which is not at all bad. However, there are 4 oil and gas companies on the top of the list that are bigger. a lot bigger than Apple. If we phase out the fossil fuel economy and replace it with renewable energy, these companies, at least the fossil fuel companies, will go out of business. Hence, the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates are in a desperate battle to survive. The difficulty is that their survival comes at the cost of making it difficult for life on Earth, including human life, to survive. When I first started reading the book, Why Scientists Disagreed About Global Warming, I hadn't read the webpage introducing the book or any of the Amazon reviews, or watched Ken's introduction about it. I found myself confused and almost started believing what I was reading until I took a step back and realized that this book was, in fact, denying climate change. I'm shocked at their convincing skills. Well, the first time that I taught Climate Change 101, a number of people similarly jumped right in the reading Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming without first encountering my framing of the selection. Shouldn't have done that, but although I certainly didn't intend for this to happen, these became, in a certain way, an interesting case study in the effectiveness of the work. And make no mistake, it was effective. Dozens of people in the class had the same response. As this person succinctly puts it, I found myself confused and almost starting to believe what I was reading, close quote. If this response, which is the response of a bright, attentive college student who are likely predisposed to already believe in the validity of the climate crisis, and I suspect all students enrolled in Climate Crisis 101 are close to that belief. If that's how they felt, how might the general public respond to such a work? When I first read Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, it became clear to me that it would likely be very effective for certain audiences. However, I have to admit to being surprised at how effective it was, even on my own students. Next comment. I went to a high school in a relatively conservative town. My freshman year of high school, I remember the honors biology teacher explaining how climate change was a hoax, only perpetuated to continue taxing Americans. I took this to be true. At that point, I was 13 years old, and I wasn't presented with other information that would contradict this argument. It wasn't until my junior year of high school that I began to question what that teacher's motives were for spreading misinformation to 13 and 14-year-olds. I then realized how many of my classmates were not going to have the same realization as I did about climate change. Many of my classmates, most likely, still believe that climate change is a hoax because of this teacher and will see it only as a ploy used to tax Americans. Yeah. The fact that the Heartland Institute mailed 300,000 unsolicited copies of Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming to K-12 teachers across the U.S. does not prove that it was effective at influencing these educators. However, there were many comments like this attesting to the fact that K-12 teachers are indeed teaching climate change denial, even in progressive states like California. Note that the approach used by this particular biology teacher buys into the aforementioned conspiracy theory that climate change is a hoax designed to create a stronger central government in the U.S. Not only would this, as previously noted, restrict the unchecked activities of a variety of industries, it would result in more taxes of Americans. Hence, the conspiracy theory creates a compelling personal reason to resist climate change action, because you don't want to get taxed. However, it should be noted that in countries that have stronger central governments, such as many EU countries, and I'm thinking here like Denmark and France, while individuals do indeed pay more taxes, they receive a great deal in return. Things that we don't have here, such as free health care, free dental care, free college educations, a higher minimum wage, and other protections for workers like 30-hour work weeks. Free and better mass transit, and the list goes on and on. In any event, it is more than a little disturbing that climate change denial is being taught to 13 and 14-year-olds right here in California, where, as we have seen, climate change is already at a crisis point with wildfires, drought, heat deaths, and other impacts. Not only do high school students receive wrong information, as with this example, but as the following comment makes clear, many simply do not receive any instruction at all on the climate crisis. It's frustrating that deniers target teachers, legislators, and business people, but quite frankly, who else do we think they would target? They want to get at the root of society, children who trust their teachers more than anyone else. As I was reading, I was reminded of all my teachers growing up. None of them talked about climate change at all. And similarly, someone in Climate Crisis 101 noted that most of what I myself learned about the climate crisis has been through this class and last quarter, the English 22 class. Unfortunately, many high school students in the U.S. have not had an introduction to the climate crisis, even in states like California that are pretty green. A big part of the problem is that California's educational code does not mandate it. Under California's Public Resource Code, last amended in 2018, quote, schools are encouraged to teach environmental literacy, which by definition includes climate change. The code does not mandate that schools teach it, however, close quote. Consequently, when an informal poll was taken in 2019 in the Oakland Unified School District, it was found that, quote, about 60% of surveyed teachers were not familiar with the state's environmental principles and concepts, and nearly 70% were unfamiliar with the recently adopted board policy for environmental and climate change literacy. So, even if there are laws enacted to encourage the teaching of climate change literacy, teachers may well just not be aware of them. The good news is that, and I'm quoting here again, more than 40 California districts and county offices of education have adopted climate change resolutions since 2017 as part of a national effort started by Schools for Climate Action. Close quote. That's a group, Schools for Climate Action. The amazing thing is that Schools for Climate Action is not a state program, but rather a grassroots, and I quote here, California-based advocacy initiative led by science teacher Park Guthrie and his students at Salmon Creek Middle School in Sonoma County. Still, although Schools for Climate Action is encouraging, it's clear that we really need state and federal laws to mandate the teaching of the climate crisis at all levels of K through 12. I know, kindergarten might sound a little young. However, personal experience with my daughter when she was in kindergarten has convinced me that children can really understand the situation. For example, as I explained to my daughter, just as veggies are good for your body and treats are not, wind turbines and solar panels are good for your health, but burning coal and oil is bad. It's that simple. Similarly, bicycles are good, gas guzzling SUVs bad. Beans and lentils good, beef bad. It's really just that simple. Moreover, this education needs to continue at the university level. Currently, neither UCSB nor the University of California system requires that students learn about the climate crisis. As far as I'm concerned, this absolutely needs to change. After reading the start of this book, I am in shock. This is the next comment. This highlights a deep flaw that we face in our time, which is Google and the ability to find anything. It leads to a problem called confirmation bias, which is a term used in psychology referring to the act of only acknowledging opinions and facts that align with your prior beliefs. If someone was in denial or concerned with their day-to-day problems and didn't want to deal with the reality of climate change, they would seek out this book to confirm what they already think. So far, we have only been talking about books like Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. However, most people do not get their information from books nowadays. As this comment notes, the starting point for many people is now Google. So if you type in something related to the climate crisis into your browser search field, this is the way you start. A list of 10 sources appears before you can blink. As you scroll down, you tend to dismiss some options and click on others. For example, if you're a climate change skeptic, you click on choices that are in accord with your beliefs. Why is that the case? As this comment very perceptively notes, there's something called confirmation bias, and it's at work here. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values. People display this bias when they select information that supports their views, ignoring contrary information, or when they interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing attitudes. Confirmation bias is just one of a number of cognitive biases that human beings share. As all of us, are susceptible to these, it means that there is a real danger of us falling down any number of online rabbit holes. Moreover, it has been argued that Google is manipulating search and news results to bias them towards what it thinks it knows about people based on the troves of personal data that it accumulates and has on them. This filtering and censoring of search and news results is putting users in a bubble of information that mirrors and exacerbates ideological divides. So not only, do people, by virtue of their confirmation bias, select only things to confirm what they believe, but Google itself is offering up search results that it believes are in accord with the beliefs of the person doing the search, based on the information that it has compiled about us. This is not the result of the actions of climate change deniers, but rather is the way that our brains and Google's algorithms work. In practice, this means that we can very easily slip into an online bubble where people believe, for example, that the climate crisis is a hoax. Yeah, and once there, it only gets worse, as there are very few online communities. They're very active online communities of climate change deniers. So if you happen to stumble upon one of these, for example, one of their boards, you will likely find nothing but people who are sincerely convinced that the climate crisis is in fact a massive hoax. If you hang out there long enough, they may well convince you too. But why, you may ask, would someone agree with something, outlandishly improbable, like the fact that the entire scientific community and the collective nations of the earth are perpetuating a massive global hoax by making up something like the climate crisis? Unfortunately, and to make things worse, human beings seem hardwired to be drawn to conspiracy theories as a way of, one, understanding one's environment, and two, feeling safe and control of one's environment, and three, maintaining a positive image of the self and the social group, and that's the group to which you belong. Hence, although we might hope that our knee-jerk response to an outlandish conspiracy theory would be, just simply rejected, we're in many ways hardwired to be predisposed toward it. To add on to the list of hypocritical things that climate change deniers have done, I'm sitting here thinking about what Ken said regarding the billboard with the Unabomber saying, "I still believe in climate change. Do you?" Do climate change deniers know what we could put on a billboard? I keep thinking of different prominent climate change deniers, but in the end, I think the most effective billboard would just be a barrel of oil that read, "I don't believe in climate change, but I also don't have a family in Miami." First, I'd love to see that billboard. Second, it's interesting to note that while fossil fuel interests are often highly effective, including in their use of media, in getting out their message, the same sadly cannot be said of groups and individuals attempting to spread awareness of the climate crisis. Certainly, climate crisis do their part, but they are generally not trained as public communicators. And this is an issue that we'll take up further. Okay, thanks.